the Polgar Chess University. A few weeks ago, I showed you a game that I played in my early childhood, and I got numerous emails how interesting that was to look at it from a perspective of a game that you can easier relate to. Because many times I may show games that are more advanced level that is harder to associate with. So again, I chose a game of mine that I played a long time ago when I was in my early years of my chess career. I had the white pieces and the game started the following way. e4, d6. d6 is a regular opening. It's called a pair. And it's true that black does not immediately put a pawn on e5 in the center. However, d6 is also a very reasonable move, opening the diagonal for the black bishop to develop. White played d4, rightly so. If you have a chance to put both your center pawns in the middle on the fourth rank as white, you typically should do so. My opponent decided to develop the bishop in a fianchetto way. When a bishop does not develop on its initial diagonal, but it develops instead on a longest diagonal for the dark squares a1, h8 or h1, a8, that's called to fianchetto the bishop. Of course, the purpose of black's last move is to develop the bishop to g7. I played knight c3, developing my knight following the basic opening principles, that is, develop by controlling the center. This knight move now controls two squares, d5 and e4. Typically, after black plays g6, the very best move to follow it up is to move the bishop to g7. You may wonder, how about a move moving the bishop to h6? Typically, I do not recommend that move in the early part of the game because white would exchange the bishops and that would force the black knight to an awkward square on the edge of the board. So it's not a great idea. Also, after black would castle on the king's side, black can miss that bishop defending the king. Let's go back to the actual game where my opponent responded by playing knight to f6. In this case, I would say it's slightly more accurate to develop the bishop first rather than the knight. When you play g6, as black did on the last move, it's best to follow up by the bishop developing immediately without any delay. I continued developing myself, knight f3, and so did black's bishop to g7. Now we're having a very standard position that has been played even by grandmasters thousands of times. Now white should follow up by developing the bishop, preferably the one on the king's side, so I get to castle as soon as possible. And so I did play bishop d3. While it certainly looks like one of the most logical moves, controlling the center, developing, getting ready to castle, nevertheless, it is more accurate to bring the bishop only to e2 in this case. The primary reason for that is that in view of the black bishop coming to g4 creating a pin, if the bishop goes to e2, there will be no pin. The knight will be still free to jump. I continued with bishop d3. I didn't know better at the time, and my opponent castled. So far things are going pretty smoothly on both sides. After all, both sides have already castled, and we're only on the sixth move on the game. And here my opponent played another very natural move and typical move for such positions, c5, initiating action in the middle of the board. One of the most typical ways to create action to create threats or something to happen after the initial developing moves in the game is to offer an exchange of pair of pawns. And that's exactly what black is doing right now. Black is offering either for white to capture the black pawn on c5, or if I don't do so, then black could capture my pawn on d4. Probably, knowing today what I know, I would rather right now capture myself on c5, or even just push my pawn up forward to d5. Instead, I played again a very natural move, playing bishop to e3. The challenge here is that black could play knight to g4, and that means that the knight wants to capture my bishop on e3. For example, if now pawn would capture on c5, knight would capture on e3. When I recapture, pawn captures back, and I would be stuck with doubled pawns. As we know, doubled pawns are usually a big disadvantage because the pawn that's behind is not able to move. So most of the time we consider having double pawns as almost like being half a pawn behind. So I would certainly not want to allow something like this to happen. On the other hand, the problem is that if I would move my bishop away, then I would end up losing a pawn, which is even worse than allowing my pawns to be doubled. Right now, the black bishop protects on d4, and therefore white just lost the pawn. So after my inaccurate move, bishop e3, my opponent did not take advantage of this, but immediately captured on d4. Right now, I'm in a dilemma situation because even if I capture with my knight, which would be the natural thing to do, my opponent would have the opportunity to play knight to g4 and go after my bishop. Again, I would face the same type of problem that if I move my bishop, my opponent will capture bishop g7 to d4. As we can see, the bishop actually is misplaced on d3 in this type of position if I'm allowing the trade on d4 between the pawns. So once my bishop was on d3, I should have made sure that after my opponent played c5 on move 6, I would have either captured his pawn or would have pushed the pawn forward instead. In the actual game, I chose to capture with my bishop instead of the knight. And my opponent's response was a good and natural move, knight c6. Typically, if one side can trade a knight for a bishop in a regular position, it's a good thing, even though both the knight and the bishop are considered having a 3-point value. Nevertheless, in most situations, the knight is slightly inferior to the bishop. So generally, do not trade a bishop for a knight unless you have to avoid material loss or getting checkmated. And that's what I did. I made sure I tried to save my bishop and retreated to e3. Here my opponent played a natural move, perhaps not the best though. d5 looked like a better move here than what my opponent chose. After d5, black is threatening to advance the pawn even further and create a fork on my bishop and knight. And also, after the exchanges on d5, black has activated his bishops, opened some files and diagonals, which would have been to black's advantage. Again, another reason why my bishop is not ideally placed on d3. Would my bishop be on e2 instead, then my queen would also control the d5 square, and black couldn't so easily just play d5. The game continued with bishop to g4, creating a pin. However, this pin is not terribly dangerous because I could have simply played h3, asking the bishop where it wants to go. If the bishop trades for the knight, that's a little bit of an accomplishment for white. And if it retreats, that is as well. I decided to retreat my bishop to e2 finally, where it really belongs in this position, to unpin my knight. That means that now my knight is safe to move, while as long as my bishop was on d3, my knight was not able to move without losing my queen. By the way, a very important point, moving the queen out of the pin in such situations is usually a mistake, because after bishop takes knight, only the pawn can recapture, and then not only that white created double pawns on the f-file, but just as importantly has weakened the critical g2 square in front of the king, and black may develop an attack by moving queen to d7 and then h3 and so on. Let's go back to the game where I retreated my bishop to e2, and my opponent, without any need or obligation, decided to trade the bishop for the knight. As I mentioned a minute ago, generally it's not a good idea to give a bishop up for a knight without any specific reason or gain or avoiding of loss. I recaptured with my bishop, and this is where my opponent chose the wrong direction. Here black should be trying to develop counterplay on the queen side, for example with moves like rook c8. It's a half-open file, black has no pawn on the c-file, therefore it's a natural place to look for counterplay. Also, typical moves would be trying to play knight e5 and knight c4, again trying to work creating a counterplay between the c-file as well as the power of the bishop on the long diagonal, and trying to attack targets that are there. For example, the pawn on b2 after the black knight would appear on c4 could be a serious target. So those are the type of situations that black usually tries to go for when they play correctly. My opponent continued by playing e5. This is a wrong idea for many reasons. First of all, it weakens the d6 pawn. Now that pawn is considered a backward pawn, a pawn that can never ever be protected by another pawn and is on an open file, becomes a target and is considered a weakness, and we call it a backward pawn. Also, it's an important element that white has a pawn on e4, stopping its advancement in the future. Therefore, I can try to double up on the d-file my rook and try to attack it. The second reason why e5 was not a good idea is that black has locked in his best piece, the bishop on g7, that had such a huge potential, controlling potentially a lot of squares on the diagonal. For example, after the knight would move to d7, it would be a real powerful bishop, and it's a real shame to lock it up by playing e5. I continued by queen d2, getting ready to get my rook to the d file and to target the pawn on d6, and my opponent chose queen d7. Rook a d1, rook f d8. I attacked the pawn a second time and my opponent protected it. And here I played knight b5, trying to go after the pawn, although black has an easy way to defend against that, retreating the knight. And here I made a strategical error. Today, of course, I would know that the bishop on g7 would be considered a bad piece because, as I mentioned a minute ago, black has just locked it up by playing e5, largely restricting its mobility. Therefore, it's not in my interest to exchange my dark squared bishop for black's. If you just look at the difference in mobility between the two bishops, you can notice that the white bishop controls a7, b6, c5, d4, f4, g5, and h6. That's 7 different squares. While its counterpart, the black bishop, can only go to 1, 2, 3, or 4 squares. That means the white's bishop at the moment controls almost twice as many squares as black's. And also, as I mentioned, black doesn't have much potential because this pawn on e5 cannot get out of the way there as it has a white pawn blocking its way. So, as of today, I certainly would not play what I did, playing bishop h6. I should have focused my attention on black's weakness on d6, trying to double up my rooks, and play differently. At the same time that bishop h6 has been a strategical error, actually it also has a tactical flaw. Namely, my opponent could have, instead of playing a6, which she chose to do, traded my bishop and then take advantage of the fact that my knight on b5 is unprotected and play knight b4, create a discovery attack on my knight as well as target my pawns, especially the one on c2, and cause me serious headaches. Let's go back. My opponent did not see that and played a6. I retreated my knight and she played b5. Now my knight can occupy this ideal square on d5, on one hand blockading black's weak d6 pawn, which is a good idea, and at the same time also creating a threat of a fork, namely to play knight b6. My opponent responded by playing queen e6, getting out of it. Of course, the fork from knight c7 would be not sound because the black knight would capture my knight. And here, again, it's perhaps a better idea not to trade bishops, but retreat the bishop to g5, for example, and keep those bishops on the board. Although white also has a pretty nice advantage in this position as well, purely because of the weakness of the d6 pawn. And here I played h3, which has some ideas to play bishop g4 in the future. And here my opponent made a decisive mistake. She should have played knight to d4 and then meet, if I play bishop g4, with f5. The big mistake that my opponent made here was moving the knight to f6. It's a very typical mistake that even players who are looking out for what the opponent wants to do forget that, let's say there was no threat, right? And they make a move, but that move may allow an unexpected new threat. So that's another thing, that's the next step. After you consistently have the habit of looking out for your opponent's threat, you have to make sure that also, if there was no threat, that if you're considering your next move, to make sure that that move will not all of a sudden allow something that was not a threat earlier. Like here, remember we were mentioning that knight c7 did not work earlier because the knight was on e8, but because that very knight from e8 left, went to f6, now this fork is possible and I'm winning an exchange, winning a rook for my knight. My opponent thought at least let's get a pawn for it, but after knight takes rook and rook takes knight, I'm also getting a pawn on d6. So at the moment, I'm up an exchange which is being up 2 points, the difference in value between white's rook and knight. The rook moved to c8, protecting the knight, and I played rook a1. To activate my rook, if black now captures a pawn on b2, the pawn on a6 will be fallen as well. My opponent chose an even inferior move, moving the queen to e6. Remember the general principle: exchanges usually, pretty much 99% of the time, help the side who is ahead in material. If you're behind in material, like black was in this case, you should try to avoid exchanging, especially your most powerful piece, the queen. I happily traded queens, and of course could have and should have captured now the pawn on a6. Instead, I guess I was afraid of allowing the black knight coming to d4. Today I wouldn't have been afraid, and I played c3, preventing that. My opponent rushed back to defend the pawn on a6, and now the next thing to do is to activate my other rook by occupying the only fully open file. Now my rook is about to come into d6 to target the pawn on e6. My opponent played knight e8 to prevent that, and now I played bishop g4, attacking the pawn on e6. And here, my opponent made another mistake that led to further loss. Black's best choice was to move the king near the pawn and protect it. Instead, my opponent used the rook to protect the pawn, which is a major mistake because it allows me to use my rook to attack both black knights at the same time. And that's another fork. Now one of the two black knights are lost. My opponent moved to knight f6, and I just grabbed the knight. Now I'm up a whole entire rook. The game ended in a few more moves. And now rook a8, attacking the pawn a second time. Black has no pieces to defend it. And pretty much the game is hopeless, and in this position my opponent resigned. My next plan would be to create a passed pawn by advancing the c3 pawn to c4, and then with the help of the rook make it a queen, and then just checkmate the queen and rook. Well, what's the moral of the story? If you go back to black's 11th move, remember that one. Try to not to limit your own pieces. By black playing e5, black locked up his own bishop. That was the first mistake, as well as at the same time it created a permanent weakness in black's position on d6. And then, of course, always look out for little tactics, little traps, like what black allowed on move 19 with knight f6, or later on with rook c6. In both cases, black allowed a fork. Thank you for listening. So long, until next week.